Spheres podcast. This is Sabrina Monarch, and this is a show about spiritual lifestyle and personal evolution. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, a clairvoyant, and a thought leader, and I started this podcast to have eclectic and impactful conversations about astrology as well as all things spiritual and personal development.
Happy holidays. Sharing again a few months late, Saturn is transiting my Mercury after all, and the slowdown is real. But I'm sharing a gorgeous conversation that I had with Ariana Felix, formerly known as the Dream Mommy, about the Great Defrosting in review. The Great Defrosting is a term that Ariana coined about Saturn's transit through Pisces after 5 years of Saturn transiting the Saturn-ruled signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. So extra cold, extra Saturn into Saturn answering to Jupiter. We're almost at the end of this transit of Saturn and Pisces, so this conversation serves as a looking back and making meaning of where we've come from, with a lot deeper realizations about Pisces and the nature of spiritual maturation that has anchored into our bones and cells. So as you're looking back at even just year 2025, you can consider your evolution from the year behind you, plus the full 2.5 years of Saturn in Pisces, and let this episode deepen your harvest of all the ways you've spiritually and emotionally matured this last year and this last 2.5 years. One of our anchor points for this conversation is on letting yourself be a dumb bitch, which is Ariana's invite into letting yourself incarnate into the messiness of human life instead of avoiding incarnation and avoiding your experience by opting out of things in advance with some premature judgment of being above it, without actually having had the real life experience that would reveal our learning process back to us. That some things we just learn through experience itself. So, in other words, let yourself be a dumb bitch. You'll find out more what we mean as you listen. Ariana Felix is a writer and astrologer, primarily interested in spiritual sovereignty and creative ruthlessness. You can read her creative nonfiction on her Substack publication, Agua Dulce. Enjoy our conversation.
Hey everyone, I'm here with Ariana Felix, and I should have been recording. We were just talking about what you've coined the Great Defrosting, which was Saturn's transit in Pisces, which we're actually in again in its last final stretch since it retrograded back. And you were just saying the subtitle is "Let Yourself Be a Dumb Bitch" in response to me sharing that something that's been kind of magical in my life recently is just letting myself make mistakes that another part of me would have repressed from the whole plot line before to just begin with. Like, oh, I know that's a bad idea, or I know that I'm acting like so foolish. I may as well not even live. I may as well not even choose to jump in the pool. I may as well not even choose to incarnate. Like Pisces, I think, is about like making the splash and being here and not just, slipping quietly into the night and not existing. And if you have all that wisdom from a Piscean perspective and you do the thing, thicken the plot, live for the plot anyway. And I'm rambling, so let's just back up and welcome back to the podcast. It's been too long and I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be back. Last time we talked was the beginning of our Saturn return. And now we're like rapidly approaching our opening sextile. Now that we're at the end of Saturn Pisces and Saturn Aries. So you're not rambling at all. That was a perfect prelude. I'm just going to bounce right off of it because what you're saying about Pisces being the wisdom of making the splash, of thickening the plot, and this kind of like recognition of what you were just calling the fear consciousness around doing exactly that. I'm like, well, that's also Pisces. Like, it makes me think of one of the most rudimentary like aspects of Pisces, which is its glyph. It's constellation, the two fish, the yin yang, the polarity, the like extremes. So I'm like, Pisces is absolutely like jumping into the deep end, maybe even bungee jumping, depending like what sign your Jupiter's in. But it's also the terror of doing exactly that. It's the terror of life. And I think I've like, my moon, here's my credentials, moon in Pisces. And it's in the 8th house. And I think I often have thought of that as like why it's so like engrossed in fear and shame and like, these things that we think of as the eighth house topics, but getting to know other Pisces people, like their Pisces placements being in different places, such as yours being the first house, it really reveals that like, no, that actually might just be part of what comes with the end of the zodiac.
Yes.
Might just be part of what comes with the end of consciousness, if we think about the zodiac as that circle of life. Because the terror and the ecstasy, like are fucking hand in hand.
Yeah.
And so, and it's like actually the more clearly you can see your fear and your terror of defrosting, of engaging with your great defrosting of what I essentially mean to be your heart, your life, yourself, the more you're going to reach those what we call the heights of ecstasy, right? Like that we're searching for, especially as Pisces placements, but it like comes through engagement, direct engagement with that terror, So I think that's like
Ooh.
things are just really inextricable, and that's something during the Great Defrosting, which started March 2023, right? Saturday.
Yeah. And just for the listeners, by the way, like the Great Defrosting, I've really loved that term that you've given the transit of Saturn and Pisces. And so that was after Saturn spent like 5 years in its home signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. Can you just like tell us what the Great Defrosting is from that perspective? Because it's brilliant. Like it became part of my inner lexicon for this transit. And yeah, I'd love to hear
Oh,
what
awesome.
it means.
Yeah, I love the way it like latched onto so many people's consciousness because it just like was one of those things that clicked. And yeah, I always feel like it's not because I made it up, it's because it dropped in, Like I wasn't sitting on my whiteboard being like, what can I
No, I would love to come up with things like that. Like Mystic Medusa was one of the astrologers that I first followed when I was really young. And she called the Uranus Pluto square back in 2012 to 2015 the Zap zone. And it was really important. Like her coinage of like what the transits were, it catches, So I hope I catch one of those someday. But yeah, the
Yeah.
Great Defrosting.
So yeah, so what end of 2017, Saturn entered Capricorn, which, Saturn rules Capricorn. So Capricorn is an earth sign, so we're getting heavy Saturn and heavy earth, and that can sound negative, but just think of a mountain essentially. And we're going to extrapolate this mountain into the entire arc of the Great Defrosting. So we can think of Saturn and Capricorn as climbing the mountain. At the top of the mountain, we have Saturn in Aquarius, and Saturn also rules Aquarius. So we have another heavy emphasis on Saturn, but this time Saturn is cool, it's icy, it's cold, it's alone. It's very much so, there's not a lot of oxygen at the top of the mountain. There's not a lot of space for other people, it's the tip. So it's the most isolated zone of the mountain,
Right.
and it's
And
also the most aerial view.
wow, this was the pandemic, like started with Saturn and Capricorn, and then the social distancing and quarantine stuff was largely Saturn and Aquarius, I feel like. And yeah, also the rush on the internet of people studying astrology happened with Saturn and Aquarius, and people were like, yeah, at home baking bread and learning astrology, basically.
The baking bread part was the Uranus and Taurus square, right? Unexpected return of homesteading. But yeah, March 2020, Saturn entered Aquarius. We reached the top of the mountain, and this deep freeze took place. So the Saturn in Capricorn, end of 2017 to early 2020s, climbing the mountain. Saturn enters Aquarius. The globe shuts down, and we really entered this deep freeze period. But that is marked by a lot of what we would consider air element activity, right? Like you said, the internet and like social conversations and social engagement happening on this like these invisible others, like if you had Wi-Fi, you could be busy, you could be connected. Um and so that we also want to think about that as like a deep solidification. Like Saturn in Aquarius is fixed. Saturn in Capricorn is cardinal, so it's able to move. It's moving up the mountain. It's making moves up the mountain. Saturn in Aquarius is stillness. So there's like again with like thinking of the ice and it becoming solid. Ice is solid water. So what then happens with Saturn in Pisces? Saturn enters Pisces March 2023, and the water begins to melt. Pisces is a little warmer than Aquarius. It's also a water sign. It's not an air sign. And so the water starts melting and starts coming down the mountain. And this is the Great Defrosting. So everything that built up with Saturn and Capricorn became solidified ice with Saturn and Aquarius, began melting March 2023. And that brings us all the way to the bottom of the mountain, which is Saturn and Aries, so um Saturn, I feel like Saturn Aquarius is started from the bottom. Now we're here, it's as high as you can get on the mountain. But then Saturn and Aries is like somehow we fell down the mountain and we're back at the bottom. We're back at ground zero. But in between that, there's this beautiful process, these waters that are kind of coming down and making the earth muddy and fertile and able to like plant things. And Saturn and Aries is very much that, like, let's initiate, let's plant, let's begin something. So I broke that down even further with Saturn and Pisces because we want to look at rulership. So we want to look at Pisces being ruled by Jupiter. And this created three distinct phases. We had Saturn and Pisces ruled by Jupiter and Taurus. That was very melty, buttery, warm, delicious, soft, cushy. Everyone was like socializing again. You could be together. It was this kind of physical renaissance. And then there was Saturn and Pisces ruled by Jupiter and Gemini. And so the first phase was that March 2023. Well, Jupiter would have entered Taurus a few months later, but essentially spring 2023 to spring 2024 was Jupiter in Taurus. So we were really getting soft and muddy. And we kind of, that like lotus flower analogy is really what I think of, because bringing that mysticism into this earth-based language and this earth-based style is what I was experiencing with that first phase of Saturn and Pisces ruled by Jupiter and Taurus. Then we had Jupiter enter Gemini 2024 into spring 2025. And this was a very different energy. Gemini is airy, Gemini is multiplicity, Gemini is scattered, is spread out. And so that also created a square, this tension between Saturn and Jupiter. So we had existential crisis. We had like spiritual and faith-based development crisis. We had just like intellectual, political crisis. There was this tension. But it was still, the overarching theme being defrosting. Like, how can we break out of what has become solidified? And we need that square, we need that tension to do that. So breaking out of dogma, breaking out of solidified ideas, breaking out of solidified self-concepts. And then we arrived to the present moment where Jupiter entered Cancer, and this began phase 3, but then Saturn entered Aries. So we had kind of like a big giant red pause button on the Great Defrosting. Not even a pause. Let's call it an acceleration. That's one of the things that I was calling. It was like this great acceleration where Saturn Aries is just so hot and dry. It's like now all the water is melted. There's this giant mess of water at the bottom of the mountain, and some people are drowning, right? This is like global warming, right? It's kind of what we could think of this past summer 2025 as. And extrapolating this to like a spiritual perspective, right? Like what happens when a lot of heat and pressure is supplied to the psyche or to the spiritual body? We get initiation. So we get initiated into this new realm, this new Saturnian world. But then early September 2025, Saturn retrogrades back into Pisces. And here we are officially in phase 3, which is ruled by an exalted Jupiter in Cancer. So now we have Saturn in a water sign, ruled by Jupiter in a water sign, and Jupiter in Cancer is resourced. It's well supported. So the final phase of the Great Defrosting is this like really deep, beautiful trine between Saturn and Jupiter that is integration, like we were talking about before we started recording. Integration, remembering, connecting. It's kind of like, just water on water. Right, this merging, this combining, this alchemy that can really only happen when two planets are in the same element and they have this like ease of communication and this flow. And so phase 3 is September 25 into February 2026. And it's going to feel like probably the most slow, most delicious phase of the Great Defrosting because of that. It's also Jupiter. It's also the most short-lived phase. We got a year with the other Jupiters. We only get 6 months with barely, I think, with Jupiter in Cancer. So phase 3 is very short and sweet and to the point. And the point being, how wide, how big, how faithful can you be with your heart, with your imagination, with your dreaming, with your not just desire, but with your connection to the morphogenetic field of all things. That's that interconnectedness of Pisces. And I feel like Saturn in Pisces specifically is the discipline of developing that connection to the interconnection.
Ooh,
So my signal.
one moment. I'm going to let my cat out and respond. That's incredible to hear this retrospective and also just be placed in this moment and feel so much resonance with what you're sharing. And yeah, I've been in the sexological intimacy coaching training, and we're at the end. This has been huge, a lot of defrosting. And I've had just like a lot of, yeah, new experiences in the heart, lots of body experiences, and also like chronic pain that has really started to open itself up to me in terms of what it's about psychologically. Because I started journeying with it and being like, what are you defending? Because I was dealing with it at all these different levels, including the physical and, physical therapy type things. But I began to notice that the pain was really connected to my emotional states and whenever I was in fear or gripping or bracing in some way. So I started to become resource and responsible for like all this deep, unconscious, inner child, like kind of material. And yeah, I do have the resource now for it in many different ways. Um, and it's really profound. Like it's all kind of stuff too that my whole life has been, a lot of my life has been built around the dream that this would all get better for me, that I'd be saved from it. And like
Right.
kind of yeah, this like harsh, but kind at the moment reality check that, you know, it's not the most desirable path. Like kind of trying to enlist people to save this part of me is complex and has psychological consequences. It's not the great thing that I think I'm actually looking for. And that it's so much more powerful as I go in and do these kind of soul retrievals or inner child healings and watch my reality immediately morph and shift. Like this transit has taught me to like dream and imagine again and shown me the parts of me that were afraid to even dream, even though so much of my life is built on these dreams that I've believed in the past. So yeah, it's been really just having Saturn move through Pisces, like learning how to have faith and trust life again after how you've also situated Jupiter and Gemini as a crisis in faith. Now looking back, I can see how that was at play for me. Um, yeah, so thank you so much for that context. And like, I'm wondering how you got to all of that, like how you got inspired to focus on the Great Defrosting or like this whole arc, when that kind of landed for you.
Well, that's a great question. If only I kept track of these things. It was probably during writing. Like I probably went to write about like a vague memory I have, if it's even an accurate one, is sitting down to write about my experience of Saturn and Pisces. And yeah, the Great Defrosting as a language just dropped in. And then as usual from there, like once I have a key phrase or word, everything else just drops in. So then I realized like there are 3 phases and started working with each of those. So I did different like rituals and programs for phase 1 and 2. But yeah, I think it also part of my intimate relationship with it was due to the fact that this was and is Saturn's transit over my moon. And that being in the 8th house. So there was just a level of unpacking, similar to what you're saying about like kind of developing this deeper discipline of dreaming, even though so much of your life has been oriented towards that way of moving in your reality. For me, it's like so much of my life has been oriented towards unpacking that eighth house. And yet when Saturn entered, it really brought a different gravity and a different weight, puns intended, to the level of mastery. There's another good Saturn word where it's like, with my moon there's, I'm always like digesting, processing, recycling, unpacking. But Saturn was like, do you know how to unpack and actually put away? Right, it's like coming back from a long trip. Like, can you actually unpack, wash the laundry, fold, put everything away, like in a complete cycle? Can you complete the cycle? Versus just constantly unpacking and then, the room just getting more and more full of clothes and belongings. And so this mastery felt like, well, in order to do that, in order to actually let go, another Pisces phrase, in order to actually let go, I needed to defrost the layers of ice, the layers of self-protection that I had between me and like feeling grief. Forget about fear and shame and these other like things that kind of live on top, like just feeling the original sensation of grief attached to like whatever the different things were that I was unpacking. And so that was my personal relationship with it. And the phases were fun to play with and were also fed by my direct experience. That's all my work as an astrologer in the last 15 years has been fed by my direct experience. I don't approach things from a theoretical standpoint necessarily, which is why I think the frameworks that I create and the way that I talk about things has so much resonance, because I'm like, I'm living this. I'm not forecasting it or delineating it. I'm trying to find articulation for like what the lived experience of this transit is, of working with this planetary ancestor in this specific way is. So the Great Defrosting was my own commitment to, as a Saturn and Aquarius individual, really releasing any self-concepts, any solidified ideologies, any externally placed or internalized inhibitions that were keeping me from like completing the cycle. Unpack, wash, fold, put away.
Yeah, this completing the cycle part is really inspiring to me as well, because it's so Piscean. I think it's like one of the things I experience with Pisces is the dream coming to life, like the paradise and like the deep come up, the big come up. And then also the end of the story, right? Like the romance and the breakup, or, life and death. Um, but it's the whole arc, and the back end of the arc, I think, can get really messy in some sense, because there's a gripping or a fighting, the letting go, or a fighting, learning the lesson, harvesting, integrating the learning, which then just perpetuates, the cycle, because then a new circumstance, a new relationship, a new experience will come up to try to repeat that same story. So if you, learn the lesson, and I kind of was having this experience as well during this transit of like, the more that I learned about embodiment and these things that I picked up from the training, it allowed me to slow down the ocean wave of my deepest, biggest feelings. Like, I learned how to slow time and get more granular about everything that was happening and pick apart the different things that were happening, which was giving me more choice and agency in the moment than I'd ever felt in my life. And, up until then, I'd had so many experiences of just slipperiness, like suddenly arriving to a place in the story and being like, wait, this is too far. Or like, how many things did I override to get to this point where now I'm just dysregulated and overwhelmed? And that was so confusing, right? So learning how to slow down the wave, I then got to experience my life play over again, the same things that I've literally been trying to learn my whole life, except it was happening in slow motion. And I gained choice points in the story that I didn't have access to before. I made different decisions, better decisions, learned the lesson, and then got to experience new stories with an upgrade and more things that I was supposed to learn and complete. And it just was humbling in this way of like, I've been hoping and searching for a lot of my life for circumstances to appear in my life that just bypass these lessons. Like, can I just get to the end where it's like everything's working out? And instead, I feel like my prayers were answered. I was given these experiences. I got to slow them down, but it's like it was still confronting me with the things that I've been trying to learn my whole life. And it was amazing to get to experience it in slow motion and have this awakening inside of the game or awakening inside of the story. And it was humbling just because it's like I don't get to skip. I don't get to skip this part. So yeah, when you said this part about actually putting the stuff away and not just unpacking and completing the cycle, that really, really landed.
Yeah, I love how you broke it down. That is so like accurate in terms of slowing down time and learning how to, like you said, slow the wave. That's so Saturn and Pisces. Like, um, because that is really what it is. And there's this element of like, the fear of the end, the terror of the end that comes with Pisces, the existential dread. And yet when you actually engage with the big feeling, with the, big desire, with the learning experience, whatever you want to call it, what happens after that is momentum. And I'm reminded of how Pisces is a mutable sign. It's not a fixed sign does not end the zodiac, a mutable one does. And so when you complete the cycle, what happens? Well, you keep unpacking, washing, folding, putting away, and not in this like healing addiction cycle, right? But in this, like, that's just life, the you wake up and you go to sleep and you have to do the same mundane shit. And so Pisces has a big resistance to that, like you're saying, that granularity, right? Which is
Yeah.
hard, like that like Virgo support. And I feel like having Saturn and Pisces is like such an interesting way to kind of bring some of that more like how incarnated can you become, energy into a realm that's about dissolving incarnation and moving beyond incarnation, but both of these things, like how your capacity to be incarnated is your capacity to move beyond incarnation. Because if you're rejecting incarnation, you're only reinforcing it, and you'll never be able to truly move beyond. You can intellectually, right,
Oh
but
my
not
God.
in embodiment.
You're lighting up so much. Like, this is, yeah, I'm like happily overwhelmed at the moment.
More Pisces key phrases.
Yeah. Like, one of the big discoveries that I had during this time in terms of not resisting like death and not resisting endings was about honesty and realizing that, Jupiter is really present in, and like just not to spook people, but Jupiter is present in like death charts. It's like very prominent, uh, like featured planet. And Jupiter, I think, is like, travel and the next adventure. And so there's something, Jupiter transits can bring, um, endings. And people get surprised by that because they think Jupiter is going to expand and like bring good luck. And it does, but also it magnifies things and brings it to its fullest form, which sometimes is ending. And I learned from this time period that one of my bracing and control patterns that like I'm really here to release is like not being emotionally honest with myself, therefore not with others. So, if I'm not accurately representing my experience because I'm trying to control an outcome or keep a person or something like that, like an anxious attachment type thing, that I'm basically holding up a hologram of like a false experience. So the fear that I learned early on as a kid, the ways that I would hide or be deceitful as a kid was intelligent for whatever was happening that was having me act that way. But essentially, that kind of learned behavior of I can manage and control my environment by withholding information. And then now that just creating suffering, right? And if I do reveal the truth and share honestly, it does create collapse. Like some relationships will end. And to not be afraid of that and to realize like it's setting myself, it's setting the other person free. And that part that you said about momentum, it was like getting to trust that life like actually has new horizons and that you can't hoard experiences and try to keep them around forever in a dishonest way and then hope that life will still be expansive and give you that momentum. Like there's a lot of trust that goes into being honest. And I think that, a lot of kind of tragic love story vibes, you know that feeling that the relationship is on its way out. You actually know that it's not a match. Or you know from the very beginning that it's not a match and you lie to yourself the whole time. And then as it starts to come to an end in the way that you foresaw, you're still trying to fight it. And it's like that resistance of the end, you know, there's something deeply, deeply existential in that about trusting life, trusting truth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah, that it does take trust in life, to be honest. Um, I've never thought of it that specific way. I was thinking of it during um the first couple phases of the Great Defrosting as like restoring your faith in the benevolence of life, which is exactly the same thing. And like you're saying, like there can be renewal and there can be continuation, and I think that that's what's so beautiful about the design of this transit. That we got this summer of Saturn and Aries to kind of get a taste of what's next, versus just like waiting for this. I feel like if it was just the build up to the end of Pisces, it would have felt a lot more devastating and a lot more laden with that resistance. But we got that Saturn and Aries preview of like, here's what it looks like to start over. Here's what it looks like to renew. Like, here's what it looks like to begin again. Even if just in like a tiny spark of an idea or like a vision or um, a what do I want to call it? A dream. And so having Saturn go back into Pisces now, and being so supported by its exalted Jupiter in Cancer does feel like that. I feel this newfound realization in my relationship with my reality, but it as a result of honesty, like you're saying, not avoidance. And, everything that you've shared, I could have said the exact same thing. I'm sure our stories are different. But that was really one of the things that I was even surprised I had to confront within myself. Like, I didn't even realize how much I was avoiding my own emotional honesty on the most like micro level, like, just in day-to-day exchanges and
It's
interactions.
so common. It's what the world is in so many ways. Like, there's some days, like, the more deeply emotionally honest I am, or when I have a vision inside, or when I'm talking with someone and there's like a profound attunement, usually what comes through in that conversation materializes synchronistically later in the day, or there's like, God winking at me in these ways. And I'm like, this is actually the normal state of life. Like, we grow up in the kind of colonized like world, basically, in this idea of this mechanistic separation. And so these moments of synchronicity or connection are like glitches in the matrix. And that quality of like life being with us and things happening, like we're in the right place at the right time, or there's like a magic, I think is closer to a natural state of like organic life. Um, and there's been a separation from that. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like that's a huge part of the Great Defrosting, which, I might add is a concept essentially like an esoteric concept that goes beyond the transit of Saturn and Pisces, you know. And the premise that it presides on is, or resides in, is dissolving the illusion of separation. You know, that's what Pisces is. So Saturn in Pisces is the kind of like esoteric, shamanic, spiritual discipline of dissolving that illusion of separation. And, you know, the beginning of that doesn't happen with developing the most pristine physical or spiritual ideology, right? It doesn't happen with like waking up and doing yoga every morning and meditating at night. And it doesn't happen with having the most, you know, well-developed spiritual framework and cosmology for your life. It happens through exactly what you're talking about, which is emotional honesty. That is the entryway. You know, the now moment can only ever be the entryway into the eternal. And that's the illusion of separation, is that like in order to dissolve that illusion, or actually to experience the results of dissolving the illusion, you know, oneness, unity, synchronicity, flow, happiness, joy, connection, benevolence, love, you know, and the capacity to contain all their polarities, you know, grief, rage, hate, fear, pain. Those are the results of entering that eternity, entering that state of mind body unity, as they call it. But that can only happen through the emotion of the now moment, because emotion is energy in motion, right, as they say. And so as like these three-dimensional beings and this living in this third dimension, what could be more important than, again, that process of incarnation? And people think that, like, in order to dissolve the illusion of separation, we have to reject incarnation, and we have to just mentally remember that we're one, mentally remember the flow, mentally, you know, remember the eternal state of consciousness. But in fact, all that does is reinforce the illusion of separation, because you're saying that your physical body and your real life and your real feelings are not part of the story and are not part of the great unfolding.
So maybe we bring back the dumb bitch part because that's how it feels sometimes.
Yeah. Yes, yes, yes. Let yourself be a dumb bitch in essence.
I really have had this experience. It's actually been since I was a kid. I'm just, I've really been feeling it. Like, I think it was a human design idea originally. Like, I had a reading some years ago, but something that I gained from the reading was that, like, me being selfishly attuned to my well being is part of my design in a way. And I was saying that as I selfishly attune, that it creates the experience of shock for myself and for others. And there's some greater benevolence to it or something. I'm not really describing this very well. But what I
No,
have
I
noticed, what I've noticed is that sometimes I do things because I have a really strong instinct, and it's like speaking my truth in a moment. Like I would used to maybe do it only selectively if I thought the other person would understand.
yeah.
And now I do it because my body wants to. And it's like really, I guess the word could be cringe sometimes to like watch myself have the urge to speak in a certain way, say something, even if I know that a day or two later I'm going to look back at what I said and like be able to see right through it and see like, oh, that was me speaking from my wounding or whatever. And how since a young age, I would actually curtail these communications, curtail these actions in advance because I was already thinking that they were too dumb. And now I just let them out. And it's really healing. Like the plot develops where I'm able to actually really see myself and like have a transformation. And I didn't realize until I started to just let myself express more that I was actually keeping the story stalled because I didn't get to skip this part of being like a dumb human, basically. And that, because I just notice it too, where it's like, even having like arguments or conflicts with people. Like there's some, I'm very neurotic about that internally because there's so many things happening inside of that, so many threads. And to just let myself be in conflict with someone, even if like a week or two later, I might look back and it's like, no, we had that. I had my part, they had theirs. We're learning something together. And if I had just stopped that, avoided it all, that I wouldn't have learned or. So just putting it in the phrase, letting yourself be a dumb bitch, I mean, that has been that has been the experience. And the evolution has happened just from actually existing. And I gave the splash imagery because I had like a philosophical fork in my early 20s of like, should I just exist in the most quiet way? Like, just not make a splash, like, just be completely invisible? Or should I incarnate all the way and like be shocking or be disruptive in the ways that I just naturally can be and, tell people what I really think? Like, it's really, I think even revealing impact with people, like sharing how you actually feel can be devastating, not trying to protect other people's feelings. You just speaking the truth simply without extra, like, can be so devastating in some ways. And to just trust that that's healing for me, for the other person. Yeah, instead of preventing the whole thing. And I see this a lot with Pisceans, people with strong Pisces signatures, is like this basic fear and existential hesitation, this Hamlet to be or not to be. Like, should I exist in this moment? Like, should I bring my energy? And when Piscean people do bring their energy forward, it's really impactful. It's like they're in connection to something really beyond. And it's scary at a human level at times to be holding that charge within us and to know that, like, once we let this thing out, the story is going to unfold.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, that reminds me of this Florence and the Machine lyric from the album that you and I listened to together in that rose garden in Portland, where she's like, I think it's Girls Against God, and she says, if they ever let me out, I'm gonna really let it out. And it's kind of this. I love that line because it's just a perfect like articulation of what you're saying, but it's all happening internally. The they is me, So it's more like if I ever let me out, I'm gonna really let it out. I'm keeping myself in prison. Um, and I love everything you shared. One of the best things about the practice of that emotional honesty in the moment, which I think can be one of the most beautiful expressions of Pisces in its freedom. I think again and again about Pisces as emotional freedom specifically, and developing the capacity for that. And that just happens to include honesty. But one of the best things about practicing that is that you get more and more precise about what your truth actually is. Because at first, often when you've been in the habit of repressing it, there's all this extraneous shit on top. And you think that that's your truth, and you think, saying that is your truth. And that's the cringe part that you're talking about, where after you're like, oh, actually, that was my ego. But what's great about that is, the ego can only be transmuted through being revealed. And when we're trying to repress the ego to transcend it, which can be one of the traps of Pisces, it can never be truly revealed. And so it never really gets transmuted. And it's just growing larger and larger and larger in secret, But when you become someone who's not afraid of hurting people's quote unquote feelings, a lot of that, I think we're really just talking about touching people's egos. When you become unafraid of doing that, you also stop moving as someone who is afraid of their own feelings being touched. Like you become someone who's also not afraid to be touched and who's also not afraid to receive truth. And that's the kind of invincibility, the like egoic invincibility that I truly crave. That level of audacity combined with receptivity. It's like, yes, I can receive your truth and your honesty and your now moment, and I'm not gonna like completely collapse around it, with enough practice, with enough muscle building, and because I'm someone who also knows how to do the same in return. And that's the true transmutation of the ego into an actual energetic structure that can, an actual spine. You mentioned your spine earlier, and that's an area of my body that I've been working with for many years, as I have an injury from childhood there, and that was caused by neglect, and survival and being under resourced, and so the egoic structure can become an actual like firm but flexible spine that holds up your sense of self. The point of Pisces isn't to completely abandon the self, as it exists in this like singular solar sovereign form, right? But to be able to inhabit it clearly, so why the sun is the ego, but it's also illumination, and the sun is like the self and identity and the constructs of identity, but it's also um illumination again. It just like lights it up and reveals it. And so that is the alchemical. I wrote a post about or titled this once. I don't think it's exactly about what we're talking about. I'm pretty sure it was, but it's called the alchemical arc of the dreamer. That's the alchemical arc of the dreamer. This entryway of emotional honesty into emotional capacity that then like expands the now moment into that like eternal consciousness, into that flow state, into that heaven,
Mm.
that holds everything within it. And so the letting yourself be a dumb bitch, like letting yourself make mistakes and be human is the key to godliness. They told you that cleanliness, you know, cleanliness is close to godliness or whatever the fucking saying is. But I'm here to tell you that actually being a
A
dumb
dumb
bitch,
bitch.
if you have enough like self-observational skill and like you were saying, enough resource, to be able to engage in the actual chemical process that begins the moment you let yourself be a dumb bitch. Because the moment you let yourself be a dumb bitch, if you have any kind of consciousness or awareness, you change. Whether through
Yeah.
just the acceptance of that moment, not by being like, well, I gotta go fix that, but the acceptance of that moment, you then change and the charge of it is released. And this is what healing is, releasing the charge around something. That's also what forgiveness is, releasing the charge. The healing is forgiving the past because you have to release the charge around the past so that you can truly be free to be here now, which is where everything is happening, which is where all those results that we talked about earlier, joy, love, peace, unity, flow, are. They're here now. But we're like held by the past. And I think like that is the ice that is defrosting.
Right. Because if you're trying so hard to be perfect, right, like Virgo South Node right now, like releasing perfection. But if you're trying to be cleanly and close to God by being perfect, then yeah, you're not going to reveal your ego or reveal parts of yourself in those moments. So you're just going to be holding back the ocean wave all the time. And the repression of that is really tiring.
Yeah, and it's not even perfection, right? Because that's what we call it. But what is it? We're trying so hard to be fake. And if we called it that, a lot less of us would be likely to do it. But we don't call it that because we're like, no, this is a worthy endeavor.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
perfection. It's a performance. It's fake.
And something else that's really landed recently was it's the idea that emotions are in the body, right? Which makes sense from an astrology perspective because the moon is emotions and it's also the body. And so if we can't feel our sensations or can't feel our body, which is a consequence of a lot of trauma and pain, like dissociation and numbness is a coping mechanism. So if we can't feel what's happening inside, then we only have our mental concepts of who we are and what we want. And so then, we don't know. And so I think that when it comes to like emotional honesty, there is some, journaling or like endeavor of that happens at a level of the mind, paying attention to things. But if we can't feel physically, it's hard to know what we're feeling emotionally. So I think that a lot of this kind of like disembodiment, numbness, dissociation is really common. It's just like trauma that's in the collective, basically. And to be able to go into the waters to feel is a form of incarnating in a way. It's not like, there's just even the common way of being like, I'm fine, when there's actually a lot happening. And it's like, well, what, you're like skating above that. But what happens if you go into those waters and take a dive? Like, what are you really feeling? It feels so destabilizing for people because it's going to fuck up their whole day or fuck up their identity or what they think they're doing with their lives.
All of which is supposed to be performance.
Right. So it's like that's kind of where the honesty starts to collapse those things. And people, you kind of either have to be prepared for that or trust that you're going to find your way if you start doing
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Well, I think, I have yet to see someone open up in that way and not draw to themselves the resources and support required. Um, yeah, and I think that perspective is like held up by that restoration of faith and benevolence, and the benevolence of life. But you look in any direction and it grows. And so I think when you begin looking in the direction of emotional honesty, aka living in the now moment, um, it's the most generative place to be. It's self-resourcing, it's self-generative. It actually makes me think of, you're talking about the moon and um the moon is in Taurus right now, so we're recording this where it's exalted. The moon rules Cancer, which is where Jupiter is exalted. Like that emotional realm, that kind of like constant connection as represented by moon in Taurus, a fixed earth sign. And then that in and out ebb and flow as represented by moon in Cancer, which is where it finds its domicile. Like those elemental understandings give us this information about how being there is the most generative place to be. Because moon in Taurus is what? It's fertile, it's life supporting, it's life giving, it can hold things up, it can nurture and nourish, in this earthy way. And Cancer can do the same thing. And so it's not a matter of if you will be resourced in your endeavors to be emotionally honest and to be in the moment. It's a matter of when, and can you have the
Right.
patience?
So you have to kind of take the leap.
Yeah,
Yeah. Because,
take that risk. And I think that that's like that risk is like we talked about in the beginning, part of Pisces, the terror, the fear, but also the elation and the ecstasy. But it, like you said about like, what if you didn't say you were fine, and actually entered the lunar realm, actually entered the emotional realm, like, what would happen? It's like, well, that's where real life lives. And this is part of my like departure from calling myself the dream mommy, because I'm like,
yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, by the way, too. Just where you are personally and what happened with your name shift and
mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'll tell you what happened, Sabrina. Phase 3 of the Great Defrosting. Literally, Jupiter, has been in Cancer, Saturn really entered Pisces, and then an eclipse happened in Pisces there, and it was just like, just this like big shedding of snake skin, that felt so obvious and easy and natural. But what I'll say about it here is that, you know, it felt time. It felt like enough infrastructure and what is that other word? Like scaffolding like had been built up to support me entering my real life. Like dropping into the now moments and no longer having as much of a focus on the dream, and I think that era, the dream mommy era, was the era of repair and the era of restoration and the era um of phase 1 and phase 2 of the Great Crossing, because it was like the month before Saturn entered Pisces that I became the dream mommy. So now Saturn has entered Pisces for the last time and it just dissolved away. And all names are symbolic, and so dropping the name is symbolic of like dropping the dream, dropping the illusion of separation, and actually just becoming one with myself. And there are other creative, personal, and spiritual threads that woven into that, of course, but on the most basic level, uh, that's the catalyst for the shift is just no longer wanting to play an archetype in the collective consciousness, but rather to be myself. And it sounds so, reductive, honestly, like even saying it, I'm like, that doesn't quite hold it all. Um, but that's language that I have for it now. And not that the dream mommy wasn't myself, but the dream mommy um is a role and a job. So I just essentially fired myself from the dream job that I created for myself, partly from desire and curiosity and playfulness and, just that um, natural unfolding, but also partly from survival, holding on to that dream, and now coming to place through the Great Defrosting, engaging with my own spiritual transformation that I no longer feel the need to look in that direction because I'm much more interested in what we're talking about today, which is this practice of emotional honesty and the now moment and being in the creative alchemical practice of dreaming life, dreaming real life. But now I'm more interested in the real life part of it, which was like the goal all along, so I see this evolution as a success. This is the realization of the dream mommy. Who does the dream mommy become? Me. What is a dream? My life, like so
Well, it shows that your teachings and techniques worked. Because isn't that the point of dreaming, is to realize it? And
exactly. I am my greatest success story.
and I think it's like yeah, Pisces being this bridge between the dream world and the real world. It's like, yeah, I think that attunement to being in multiple realms at once is natural for you. Um, and yeah, I've had seasons of my life where I was so actively dreaming and endeavoring to create, and then those things materialized, and I became really into the present and the material experience. And then I find that there's this cycle, and just to be able to like land in a life that you dreamt for yourself and be like, I'm here and I am, is incredible. It's worth celebrating.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, well, anything else that you want to share with us or ways that you would point us to connect with your work with you?
Yeah, so join me on Substack. It's Ariana Felix at .substack.com. That's the only place I am right now. If you go to thedreammommy.com, it'll redirect you to Substack. So my entire archive, the last 3+ years, has been retired. So the only thing that remains is my writing, and that's my focus right now. So if you want to work with me, I know as much as you do about how that will be happening in the future. Currently, I don't have any offerings. Um, but you can absolutely still engage with me on Substack, where what I'm doing essentially is writing through these processes that we've been talking about today. So it's the most intimate way into connecting with and feeding that frequency in your own world that you're building.
Well, I feel like every time I've spoken with you, um, and usually it hasn't been on the podcast, this is only the second time on the podcast. So the conversations I've had with you, um, the connection that you have to what you are processing the way that you transmit it is so intimate and deep. I loved what you said earlier about how you're, not just forecasting from a theoretical place, but you're finding language to depict what you're really feeling. And that's why it resonates. Like, I love that. Um, it's felt, I like feel that from you. And it's been really resonant and impactful to just have your visions from our conversations or what you've shared, like weave into my sight with the world and my experience. And yeah, reading I had with you that just like was uh, very pivotal in this beautiful way. So I'm just really appreciating your sight, your explorations, like how deeply you let yourself be moved and touched by life and how crisp and inspired that comes through in your transmissions. So everyone listening, check out the Substack, and I'm sure there will be something emergent in the time coming of where your work or where your creativity is taking you, and those of us that are with you.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Thank you. I received that. It's a pleasure to be received by you always. Are you gonna call this episode "Let Yourself Be a Dumb Bitch"? Or is
I
that too
should. I should, but it would be, it's like an odd hook for like the
yeah.
level of depth of the conversation, but it'd be a good podcast title.
Maybe the first line of the description.
The profundity of letting yourself be a dumb bitch. The karmic implications of letting yourself be a dumb bitch. Break your karmic cycles by being a dumb bitch.
There you go. Got it. Perfect. Everyone's gonna listen to that.
Thanks, Ariana.
Thank you.